Spider-Man: No Way Home. What a title, huh? On the surface, it seems obvious what it's about. Spider-Man is going to take a wrong turn somewhere off 42nd Street and then find himself completely lost in the multiverse without a way to get back home. Pretty self-explanatory, right? Well, what if I told you that the No Way Home title may not even refer to the webhead, but rather the new Sinister Six? Interested? Let's discuss right now. Peter Parker's whole world is in complete chaos right now. After saving the day, defeating Mysterio, and getting the girl, a game-changing curveball was thrown his way when not only was he framed for Mysterio's murder, but also his secret identity became a not-so-secret identity. Now, while the whole murder thing should be super easy to disprove at this point, I mean, this is a universe that's invented time travel and has magic after all, a doctored video should be chump change, right? It's the identity thing that's probably going to stick with Peter. It's this development that's probably going to lead Peter to either willingly or unwillingly join Doctor Strange on a multiverse adventure to either escape his current situation or try to find a solution. But here's the question that I don't think a lot of people are asking. Why does Doctor Strange specifically ask Peter for help? It has to be because Doctor Strange is dealing with a very Spider-Man related problem and needs an expert. Enter the Sinister Six. Keep in mind, this could count as potential spoiler territory as we speculate what we might see in No Way Home. If I'm right, then yes, this is a spoiler. If I'm wrong, well, I'm not going to be wrong because our theories always come true. We've known for some time now that previous Spider-Man villains from past Spider-Man franchises are making a return appearance in Spider-Man: No Way Home. The buzziest and flashiest returns include Alfred Molina's Doc Ock and Jamie Foxx's Electro. But what are their roles going to be? Alfred Molina let slip in an interview that this is the same Doc Ock from Spider-Man 2 who gets saved right before drowning, and not just another universe version of Doc Ock who looks like Alfred Molina, which means we can deduce that the same probably goes for Fox's Electro. So what's happening here? Well, this is where the title No Way Home comes into play. A new rumor has been circulating thanks to a few potential inside sources that point to the title not referring to Peter being lost in the multiverse, but rather that these Spidey villains are all plucked from their own universes and can't get back to their original realities and cause a lot of trouble along the way. If this is true, then this frames the movie not as a Spider-Man film, but more of a Sinister Six film with Spider-Man in it. And let me just say, that's a totally bold move. So if the focus is on the Sinister Six struggling to get home with a lot of collateral damage in their way, who else fills out their ranks? Well, the rumor also goes that Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin is making a return appearance as well, but not as a side villain. In fact, if sources are true, Dafoe's Norman Osborn will basically be the team captain and the main villain of the movie, and the one who helps unite all the misplaced Spidey villains as they try to get back to where they belong. Okay, so that's 3 of the Sinister Six right there. The other villains in the rumor include the Rhino, the Lizard, and the Sandman, but there's no word yet on if actors who have played those characters in past franchises will return or not. But man, I hope they can get Paul Giamatti back. That dude's a national treasure. What do you think of this lineup? Honestly, it sounds strange. For one, non-MCU Spider-Man movies have always had a problem of overstuffing their villains into one movie without developing them, so the idea of 6 sort of brand new versions of these bad guys all vying for screen time is a little concerning. Plus, this is a supervillain team that's rolling with 2 brute strength villains in the Lizard and Rhino, and is that really necessary? I don't think so. Maybe 3 of the villains will be dispatched relatively early on, leaving Doc Ock, Green Goblin, and Electro for Spidey to fight, but even that's a little iffy. Honestly, the only way I could see something like this actually working is if Spider-Man isn't in the movie at all. Sure, I know his name is in the title and everything, but picture for a moment a Spider-Man sequel that just deals with Peter Parker in his own universe, dealing with his murder charge and his secret identity being revealed. Maybe throw in Matt Murdock, aka Daredevil, as his attorney, and a new villain, and that's already a solid movie. And then separately, you make a film called Sinister Six: No Way Home that completely focuses on the 6 villains as they navigate the multiverse together. Doesn't that sound just a little bit better? But of course, that's not going to happen. Spider-Man is going to be the main hero, and he's potentially going up against 6 of the baddest villains in the whole multiverse. If that's the case, he definitely needs help. And that's where the other Spider-Men come in. Rumors have been going crazy regarding Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield's return, and at this point, if they're somehow not in it, I think the whole world would collectively break. But if this is the plot they follow with the movie, with the Sinister Six running wild and trying to get home, then it would make sense to bring in other heroes to help Peter out. And as awesome as seeing all 3 Peter Parkers fighting together would be, I'd be more excited to see what this can do for MCU Peter's character. Because right now, given the fact that he doesn't have a current mentor and both his superhero life and personal life are borderline in shambles, MCU Peter's in a tough spot emotionally. And what better person to get advice from than an alternate universe version of yourself? The other Peters could offer our Peter some valuable advice and possibly even work in a...
With great power comes great responsibility.
To help our Peter snap out of his funk. Emotional and deep character development paired with watching Andrew Garfield, Tobey Maguire, and Tom Holland all punching Alfred Molina's Doc Ock in the face? Yes, please, take all of my money.
How many Spider-Man does it take to bring down the Sinister Six? We might learn the answer to that question in Spider-Man No Way Home. It seems like every Spider-Man known to man is gonna be in the film, with Tom Holland, Tobey Maguire, and Andrew Garfield all reportedly set to make an appearance. There are even rumors on top of rumors about who we'll see making up the Sinister Six in our favorite web-slinger's third MCU movie. So, who exactly will be making up both sides of this battle? You may be surprised about how I think everything's gonna go down. We've technically seen 4 different Spider-Man on the big screen over the last 2 decades, if you count Miles Morales. We've never seen a live-action version of Miles Morales, but we know he exists in the MCU because of a deleted scene in Homecoming where we hear Aaron Davis call someone Miles on the phone.
Yeah, sorry, Miles, I'm not gonna make it.
That being said, I don't really expect to see Miles Morales in No Way Home. I wouldn't be shocked to see him in the movie, but all rumors are pointing to the 3 Spider-Men we've already seen in live-action movies appearing in No Way Home. So how exactly will Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man and Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man appear in the movie? Well, that would have to be through the Spider-Verse. We learned that the Spider-Verse is a thing in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. In that film, we saw Miles Morales interact with other Spider-Men, including Tobey Maguire's version. If all these Spider-Men exist in different universes, then it's completely possible that some of them can make their way into the MCU. After Avengers Endgame, we learned that, similar to the Spider-Verse, the MCU is a multiverse with many different branching realities. If our heroes were able to go back in time to change the universe and stop Thanos, then it's not out of the realm of possibility for some Spider-Men to leak out of the Spider-Verse and into the main MCU timeline. 3 different guys who all have the same job in a different universe. It sounds like a great team to me. The excuse for Miles Morales not showing up in the film could be that he had something going on in his universe that he had to take care of, but the others didn't. You know, the classic Captain Marvel excuse. So if these 3 make up the good team, then who's gonna be on the bad team? All signs are pointing to a Sinister Six group finally getting together in the MCU. But it's unlikely to be the original 6 from the comics. In the comics, the Sinister Six are a group of villains who work together to take out their biggest enemy, Spider-Man. The original lineup was organized by Dr. Octopus and consisted of himself, Vulture, Electro, Mysterio, Sandman, and Kraven the Hunter. We've seen a lot of these characters in previous Spider-Man movies, and we're likely to see them again in Spider-Man No Way Home. I think we'll see Doc Ock, Vulture, and Electro again, but Mysterio, Sandman, and Kraven will be replaced with Scorpion, Rhino, and Hobgoblin. We know Vulture and Scorpion already exist in the MCU, although we technically haven't seen Scorpion just yet. Vulture was the main villain of Spider-Man Homecoming and is currently in prison. It's the same deal with Matt Gargan, who is one of the Vulture's potential buyers and is Scorpion in the comics. If you played the Spider-Man PS4 game, then you know just how easy it is for a villain to be broken out of prison. This same plot could take place at the beginning of No Way Home, freeing Vulture and Scorpion. As for Dr. Octopus, Electro, and Rhino, there are rumors that each of them will be recast to appear in the third MCU Spider-Man film. This means that we might be seeing Alfred Molina's Dr. Octopus from the Raimi-verse, as well as Jamie Foxx's Electro and Paul Giamatti's Rhino from the Amazing Spider-Man movies. But that leaves one spot open in the Sinister Six for the Hobgoblin. Ned Leeds is Peter Parker's best friend and has been helping Peter as his guy in the chair since learning that he was Spider-Man. In the comics, Ned eventually becomes the Hobgoblin, and I could see this happen in the MCU as well. The thing is, I don't expect Ned to just turn on Peter out of nowhere. It's more likely that an evil version of him from an alternate universe will infiltrate the main MCU timeline as the Hobgoblin. Now that we have our teams in the blue and the red corner, it's time to get into who'll come out on top. There are rumors that Tom Holland's Spider-Man will bite the dust by the end of the movie, partly due to some leaked set photos and partly because of the Sony Marvel agreement. Personally, I think this is a bit of an overreaction by the internet. We've seen heroes look beat up after a fight many times in the MCU. It doesn't mean that they're gonna lose their life. Of course, I fully expect the good guys to win the fight, but if the Sinister Six are going to take out any Spider-Man during the epic battle, it's likely gonna be either Tobey Maguire or Andrew Garfield. That being said, if something does happen to Holland's web-slinger, then it opens the door for Miles Morales to become the new Spider-Man, assuming Sony and Marvel Studios will eventually work out a deal to make more Spider-Man films. Alright, so far, the MCU's Spider-Man films have been a little shy when it comes to personal tragedy. While we've seen Uncle Ben die multiple times throughout Spider-Man's long rebooted life, he seems nowhere to be found in the MCU so far. Now, this doesn't mean that he won't appear later on in the franchise, because let's face it here, Uncle Ben is DED dead in the MCU. But that being said, with all the Spideys slinging our way, there's a lot of chance that Peter learns the famous motto,
"With great power comes great responsibility,"
from an older Spider-Man like Tobey Maguire or Andrew Garfield coming from another dimension. Ever since the revelation that the multiverse will be an integral part of the MCU's Phase 4 with the arrival of Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, rumors and theories have been spreading throughout the interwebs. Get it? Interwebs? No? Alright, of course, the quirky yet gloomy Disney Plus series WandaVision put more and more oil on this fire. For some, it was an interesting 9 weeks of theorizing, searching for clues within every single episode's openings, and imagining the future of the MCU. For others, it was a huge disappointment, as Mephisto never actually showed up, Evan Peters' Quicksilver was actually an actor named Ralph Bohner, but let's be fair here, it was never actually confirmed that he was not Quicksilver, and most of the show was just a bunch of red herrings loosely strung together. So, with the introduction of Madripoor in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and Wolverine's Princess Bar making an appearance, I should just call it quits and stop hoping. And that's exactly what I won't do, because I clearly can't stop theorizing about this whole multiverse affair. So, okay, where does all of this madness leave our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man? The last we heard of him, actor J.K. Simmons returned from Sam Raimi's Spider-Verse as J. Jonah Jameson at the end of Far From Home to out Peter Parker as the man behind the spider mask. Rumors about actors returning from both Raimi's and Mark Webb's Spider-Verses have been pouring in non-stop in the last year. From Tobey Maguire to Andrew Garfield to Jamie Foxx's Electro and Emma Stone's Gwen and Alfred Molina's Dr. Otto Octavius, the Spider-Verse has never been this populated live-action-wise. And let me tell you, while there is a lot to unpack here, let's focus on the Spider-Man who will most probably make their way through the multiverse opened by the Scarlet Witch at the end of WandaVision.
I want Spider-Man!
Alright, let's start by discussing the Spider-Man that everyone wants to see join the MCU, Sam Raimi's Spidey, played by Tobey Maguire. While Spider-Man appeared in live-action form in the 1970s show The Amazing Spider-Man, it was not until the early 2000s, or 2002 to be precise, that Marvel fans got a taste of a Spider-Man film. It's true that Spider-Man 3 jumped the shark, and that at a very high altitude, Tobey Maguire nevertheless remains one of the most iconic live-action Spider-Man in the last 2 decades. So, if Marvel Studios are really serious about bringing the other Spider-Man, they clearly can't do it without involving Maguire in the upcoming Spider-Man No Way Home. But what exactly would this original Spidey's role be in the MCU? Well, for starters, I have a theory, or more like something I really want to happen, that Spider-Toby will actually appear in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. Since the director of the original Spider-Man trilogy, Sam Raimi, has been hired to direct what promises to be one of the darkest MCU films so far, it would only make sense that his Spider-Man be introduced somewhere along this journey throughout the multiverse. Now, I'm not saying that he'll have a prominent role in the film, but imagine for a second seeing Tobey in his Spidey suit face to face with Tom Holland during the post-credit scenes as they both point to each other stupefied. Of course, his role will have way more impact in the upcoming Spider-Man film, and could also be used as a catalyst to introduce Miles Morales into the MCU. But just like what happened to Miles as Peter Parker in his home dimension, all that would cost Spider-Toby his life. Whether in the comics or in the films, Spider-Man's growth is linked to loss and grief, one that is usually attributed to the death of Uncle Ben. While Spider-Tom started to get a taste of that with the aftermath of Tony Stark's death, he was not responsible for the loss of Iron Man. So, Spider-Toby could in some ways act as a sort of Uncle Ben when he dies, which would spark a change in Tom Holland's Spidey moving forward in the MCU, as his character has been rather childish so far. Phase 4 is all about grief and the consequences of the blip. Wanda came back without having time to grieve the loss of Vision, which caused her to spin out of control and create an ever-changing Westview inside of her hex. And Sam and Bucky are currently both navigating their way throughout this brand new world, trying to find their true purpose after the disappearance of Steve Rogers' Captain America. So the arrival of Andrew Garfield in the MCU would be the perfect moment to explore the character's grief after the loss of Gwen in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. While Toby could be used as a mentor to Tom, Andrew could be portrayed as a washed-up Spider-Man just like Peter B. Parker from Earth TRN-701, who redeemed himself by helping Miles and Into the Spider-Verse. With Emma Stone most probably returning as Gwen, this could mean that we'll get to see another Dimensions Gwen, but with spider powers. This could make things really interesting as it would introduce Spider-Gwen to the MCU, but also very confusing to Spider-Andrew. Look, to make it short, I believe that if Marvel Studios move forward with a live-action Spider-Verse, it would be the perfect occasion to have their Spider-Man grow into adulthood while continuing their exploration of the aftermath of the blip which seemed to have broken so many people, temporarily giving Earth a brand new world, one that the Flag Smashers are desperately trying to regain.
The world was shocked to learn Jamie Foxx's Electro was returning for the upcoming Spider-Man 3. But with rumors that he'll be playing a different version of the same character, the question is now, what other characters could make an MCU comeback? There was a rumor in early 2020 that suggested Charlie Cox's Daredevil would be in Spider-Man 3.
Historic.
But at that time, that felt a little preposterous. Though now, with the multiverse clearly on the horizon, could we actually see the Daredevil we've come to know and love alongside Peter Parker? It's now possible. Let's discuss. The MCU's television landscape was very different a few years ago. Although the MCU was built under the mantra, "it's all connected," it was clear that the TV side and film side of the MCU weren't seeing eye to eye. Besides a few references here and there was never much of an attempt to tie into the larger MCU franchise, and the Defenders stayed in their own little bubble. But that was a missed opportunity. Daredevil, played by Charlie Cox, quickly became a favorite amongst fans, and the actor quickly wiped away all negative connotations with the character that were previously established with Ben Affleck's version of Daredevil in the disappointing 2003 movie. With Marvel TV then being restructured and the studio announcing that Disney Plus would be having their own Marvel TV shows that tie into the larger universe, the writing was on the wall. Daredevil's show, along with his fellow Defenders, were all shortly cancelled, seemingly closing the door on any future appearances with these actors in the roles. There was a rumor a few months ago that Charlie Cox's Daredevil was going to be in Spider-Man 3, but at that time that felt a little like wishful thinking. But you fast forward to today, and it's actually not that far-fetched. With Jamie Foxx coming back as what seems to be a different version of Electro, it opens the door for other characters to return in slightly different ways. And this is where Charlie Cox's Daredevil comes into play. Fans love the character and the actor portraying him and really want to see him in the MCU. The only problem with that is the tone of Daredevil's TV show is incredibly different from the film side of the MCU. Putting Charlie Cox's Daredevil next to Tom Holland's Spider-Man would definitely be jarring, but now there's a solution. Spider-Man 3 can establish that the Daredevil we watched on Netflix took place in a different universe, and the Matt Murdock we meet in Spider-Man 3 is just this universe's Daredevil. It allows Charlie Cox to remain in the role and still fit in with the MCU's current tone. I think that's a win-win. Because Daredevil would make a perfect ally for Peter Parker right now. The last we saw Peter, his identity was being outed thanks to Mysterio and J. Jonah Jameson, and the webhead was being framed for Mysterio's murder. Although that footage should be easy to debunk, it could lead to a trial of some sort, and one of the best people to defend Peter would be Matt Murdock, and that would create a really interesting dynamic. I know one of the criticisms of Tom Holland's Spider-Man is that his movies see him always needing some type of mentor instead of standing on his own. And while that could apply to Daredevil, I think there's real value in pairing them up. The concept of secret identities is something the MCU has largely avoided. Everyone knows Tony Stark was Iron Man, Captain America was Steve Rogers, etc. Spider-Man was really the only one guarding his secret identity from the world. And Far From Home shook things up by outing his true identity. Daredevil could also be a hero who's hiding his secret identity from the world. And Peter could gain some valuable perspective by pairing up with someone who understands what he's going through. Plus, as an added incentive, seeing Spidey and Daredevil fight alongside each other, both using their heightened senses to take down bad guys, would just be too awesome of an opportunity to pass up. And what would this mean for the future? If the MCU brought in a more family-friendly version of Charlie Cox's Daredevil in Spider-Man 3, where could it lead? Well, for starters, it could re-establish the street-level type of vibe the MCU is going for with their future. Behind-the-scenes details report that the MCU is actively trying to create different layers in their franchise. With the MCU growing so big, they supposedly want to continue creating a divide between the epic cosmic side of their universe and the more Earth-based heroes. Daredevil could be a new linchpin for the street-level heroes, especially since Spidey's future seems to always be in flux thanks to the complicated Sony partnership. If Spider-Man was to disappear into the multiverse and not return to our universe, who would represent the more down-to-earth heroes? I'm just saying Daredevil could fill that role perfectly. The future of the MCU is in an exciting place right now, and Spider-Man 3 is already a hotly anticipated sequel. But if producers are thinking of making it even more epic, they should definitely bring back Daredevil, don't you think?
You know, I'm something of a scientist myself.
With Tony Stark gone, it could be time for Spider-Man to encounter foes who truly hate him instead of his late mentor. Hey, it's a superhero rite of passage. There have been plenty of hints about the Sinister Six, and I have an idea about who might be getting the team together. For a long time, the infamous crew of Spider-Man villains known as the Sinister Six were seemingly stuck in Sony's pile of movies that'll never actually get made. There was supposed to be a Sinister Six movie which would have been a spin-off of their Amazing Spider-Man series, but alas, it never materialized. Rhino, Vulture, Dr. Octopus, Mysterio, and Kraven the Hunter were all teased as members with the Green Goblin operating as their leader. Then Sony wanted to switch things up to a more comic book loyal interpretation and decided to add Sandman to the lineup and make Doc Ock the one in charge. But all of that just got my hopes up for nothing since Spider-Man swung on over to the MCU, leaving his enemies behind. Not that I don't think the MCU is the best place for him at the moment. Well, I'm ready to get my hopes crushed again, so I've been getting excited about all the clues that we could be seeing the Sinister Six in the MCU as soon as the upcoming Spider-Man movie in Phase 4. In the much smaller pile of Sony's comic projects that end up happening is Morbius the Living Vampire, and the trailer provided some tantalizing hints about the Sinister Six, and a possible connection to the MCU. There's a piece of graffiti visible on the wall behind Jared Leto's Morbius which shows an image of Spider-Man and the word murderer. Although I disagree with that description of my favorite web-slinger, it's an exciting clue nonetheless. Then there's the fact that Michael Keaton has been cast in the film and appears in the trailer in an undisclosed role. Keaton is also a member of the MCU, where he portrays Adrian Toomes, better known as the Vulture, who is one of the founding members of the Sinister Six in the comic books. As further evidence of a Sinister Six movie, there was a leaked email from Sony exec Amy Pascal. It revealed that they were working on a Spider-Man movie starring Tom Holland and taking place in the MCU. Although things were dicey for a while, Sony and Disney have agreed to share custody of Tom Holland for now, making this film a real possibility for the near future. Morbius may be a living vampire who's fought against Spidey in the comics, but he's not an inherent villain. He seems like an unlikely candidate for the Sinister Six, but the Vulture is a much better one. However, there's someone else I can more easily see leading the team, and it's someone we haven't had the chance to see in the MCU yet. Yes, I'm talking about Dr. Otto Octavius, better known as Dr. Octopus. Spider-Man has a massive rogues gallery, but we've yet to see some of his most iconic foes like Doc Ock or the Green Goblin in the MCU. Yet. Dr. Octopus is going to be a big feature in the new web-slinger attraction on Avengers Campus in Disneyland. It'll show Spider-Man battling this famous foe, which helped kick off speculation that he'll soon be introduced to the MCU. In the comic books, Dr. Octopus was the one who got the Sinister Six started when he decided to take advantage of strength in numbers to bring down Spider-Man. Well, it was a good idea in theory, but their execution left a lot to be desired. Unfortunately, finding a bunch of people who hate the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man isn't that easy, and villains aren't exactly known for their ability to get along well with others. Doc Ock learned the hard way that organizing a group isn't easy. Maybe he should have printed out some more flyers. That's a mistake that Korg is all too familiar with. But Doc Ock did end up putting together a team, including Electro, Kraven the Hunter, Mysterio, Sandman, and Vulture. They kidnapped Peter Parker's Aunt May and Daily Bugle secretary Betty Brant and held them hostage in order to get Spider-Man to appear. The good news is that he did show up, but unfortunately for the alliteration-loving Sinister Six, he took them out one by one. Doc Ock really should have spent more time on team-building exercises. And this isn't the only Spider-Man story in which Doc Ock got the team together. In the popular PS4 Spider-Man game, he puts together a group consisting of Electro, Rhino, Scorpion, Vulture, and Mr. Negative. Although he originally wanted to get revenge on Norman Osborn, Spider-Man ends up getting in the way, as he so often does. Fans have been predicting that Norman Osborn will be the next big Spider-Man villain, and it's not a bad theory. He's a major foe, a compelling character, and his company Oscorp could fill the void of power left by Tony Stark. But if we're going to be packing 6 villains together in a movie, we need to save at least some screen time for Spider-Man. Sony's Spider-Man 3 suffered because of its overabundance of evildoers, while Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse was great, even though it was packed full of spider characters. I'm not a math expert, but a quick look at the evidence shows more Spider-Man equals more success. Presenting Dr. Octopus as a disgruntled scientist would be a far simpler introduction, allowing for more time to be spent on other characters and, of course, our beloved Peter Parker. Listen, we don't want to see the same mistakes from the last Spider-Man film haunt this one, especially when we know Tom Holland has such sweet dance moves. Otto Octavius is a classic Spider-Man villain, but he's also a brilliant scientist. In the comic books, the whole reason he invented his multi-arm getup was to be able to safely interact with radioactive materials. It's possible this could even be a connection with the way Peter Parker gained his superpowers in the first place. In Spider-Man Homecoming, we heard him briefly confide in his friend Ned that he was bitten by a spider, but we don't know where the fateful irradiated arachnid originated from. This would be a cool detail to link the two characters, and frankly, par for the course considering Doc Ock's history of unfortunate mistakes. Creating his very own greatest enemy is definitely the kind of thing that would happen to him. Dr. Octopus could easily be introduced into the MCU as a scientist who experienced a serious lab accident and runs afoul of Spider-Man. And as for the rest of the Sinister Six, well, many of them are in the MCU already. The team has gone through a lot of membership changes over the years, so it's unlikely that the initial lineup will be exactly the way it was in the comic books. We've seen Matt Gargan, the Scorpion, Herman Schultz, the Shocker, and if he's alive, Quentin Beck would be a solid candidate. Although he definitely wasn't looking so good when we saw him for the last time in Far From Home. There's also the option of switching things up and adding Phineas Mason, the Tinkerer from Homecoming. He, the Scorpion, and Vulture are all connected and have already been introduced into the MCU, so they seem like a solid selection for the starting lineup. There's also an interesting aspect of the PS4 Sinister Six storyline that would be an amazing addition to the MCU. Spider-Man was searching for the Devil's Breath antidote when he got into an altercation with Doc Ock. Not only did the villain manage to escape with the antidote, but an innocent bystander ended up getting bitten by a spider that had been genetically modified by Oscorp. That innocent bystander? None other than Miles Morales. Kevin Feige has confirmed that Miles Morales exists in some form in the MCU. And we met his uncle Aaron Davis back in Spider-Man Homecoming. In the comics, Miles succeeds Peter Parker as Spider-Man after he passes away, but hopefully the Marvel Multiverse will be big enough to accommodate both heroes. As much as I'd love to see Miles Morales in the MCU, it would be tragic if it cost us Peter Parker. That Spider-Man graffiti from the Morbius trailer does resemble the PS4 version of the hero. So this could be a hint that the MCU version of the Sinister Six will be influenced by the video game version. Not only would this give Peter a whole slew of interesting enemies to battle against, but it could also set the scene for the introduction of Miles Morales as Spider-Man. I'm more of a comic book guy, but in the world of sports, I believe that's what is called a home run. And there's another reason I think now would be the perfect time for the Sinister Six to make their appearance in the MCU, and it all has to do with Tony Stark. We all know that Tony had a hand in shaping the MCU as it exists today, for better or for worse. Yes, he created Ultron, which cost us Quicksilver and a whole bunch of collateral damage, but we'll call it all even considering his heroic sacrifice during Avengers Endgame. During his time in the MCU, he made a lot of enemies, including members of his own team sometimes. But despite all of the mistakes he made, he remained a hero to many people, including his protege Peter Parker, who also saw him as a father figure. Even though Tony lost his life during Endgame, Peter Parker is still fighting his battles. During Homecoming, he had to battle against the Vulture and his allies, but the only reason Adrian Toomes resorted to a life of crime in the first place was because Tony Stark took over the cleanup of the Battle of New York. While money doesn't mean much to Tony since he had so much of it, it means a lot to Adrian, who has a family to support. So he became the Vulture, and Peter Parker ended up having to be the one to stop him, despite Iron Man making things more difficult for him. Then in Far From Home, Peter had to fight against Quentin Beck and a whole host of disgruntled Stark Industries employees who weren't the biggest fans of his former mentor. And in Quentin's defense, Tony did call his amazing new technology barf. Obviously, Mysterio and his allies caused a ton of trouble for Peter, culminating in his secret identity being revealed. Even the Edith Tony left behind for Peter ended up nearly destroying a bus full of his classmates. Peter isn't the kind of guy to hold a grudge. He even rescued the Vulture after fighting against him for all of Homecoming. But that doesn't mean that he needs to spend the rest of his superhero career cleaning up after the messes Tony left behind. He needs to be able to stand on his own and fight against villains that aren't connected to the late great Tony Stark. So far, we've seen him fight enemies with grudges against Iron Man, but Peter needs to encounter someone who really knows and understands him, and wants to take him out so that they can commit crimes without being stopped. Dr. Octopus hates Peter Parker so much that when he took over his body, he became the superior Spider-Man, just to try to prove that Peter wasn't really so great. He eventually admits that maybe Peter was better at saving the day, but still, there's no love lost between these two characters. There are some villains, like the Mad Titan Thanos, that just want to cause large-scale destruction, and don't have a grudge against particular heroes. But there's just something special about a villain that has a specific grudge against the hero fighting them. Just look at some of the most popular villains in the MCU, like Eric Killmonger, who had personal issues with his cousin T'Challa. And then there's always Loki and Thor and their infamous love-hate relationship. What Peter Parker needs in order to be his own hero and not just Tony's successor is a villain that hates him enough to form up a whole squad determined to take him down. He's already earned the ire of Mac Gargan back in Homecoming, and there's just something oh so special about the first time a villain swears to get revenge on a hero whose only crime was saving the day. Dr. Octopus is one of Spider-Man's greatest foes with a serious grudge and the abilities to back up his rage. And to bring down Peter Parker, he just might need to put a team together. Introducing the Sinister Six is risky, but Disney will make it work. Are you hoping Doc Ock heads up a squad of evildoers, or do you think it's just too many villains? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and click subscribe for more from CBR. Bye for now.
Hello everyone, welcome to CBR Saga, Spider-Man's favorite show on the internet. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about one of the most genuine friendships in the MCU, and then we're going to totally rip it apart. That's right, today we're discussing Peter Parker and Ned Leeds, and how the future for Ned might be a little goblin-y. Is Ned destined to become the Hobgoblin in some way, shape, or form? Could this best friend and man in the chair become Peter's arch nemesis? We think it could happen. Join us as we break down this heartbreaking story option, and you can decide if it will happen or not. Let's get started. I'm joined today by my co-host and good friend Nick. Nick, how you doing today?
Doing good, Jacoby. Thank you once again for having me back. Very excited to be here.
Happy to have you. So, okay, I got a big question to ask you. A very important question.
Okay.
If your best friend suddenly turned into your arch nemesis, biggest villain, how would that make you feel on the inside?
Oh, I mean, geez, you're breaking my heart. I guess I would say that while I would not condone their choices and their actions, I would. They are still my best friend. I would wish them well in their future endeavors while trying to kick their butt.
Their future evil endeavors, basically. It's like, you can do your thing. I'm going to stop you, but good luck. I wish you well.
Yeah.
Maybe some of that mindset is going to carry over to the characters that we're talking about today, because we are talking about BFFs, Peter Parker and Ned Leeds. The peanut butter and jelly, salt and pepper, other things that go together. They are just a team. These two. They started off in the MCU as best friends. Fortunately, we didn't get a drawn-out thing of Peter trying to hide his identity from Ned. Ned found out pretty early on, and from there, they transitioned into a partnership where Ned very clearly stated he wanted to be the man in the chair for Peter, and he has helped him out a lot. And I think overall, that's been a very interesting relationship in the MCU because you don't get that a whole lot. So, I mean, what do you think about their relationship overall?
I mean, I love their relationship, and you're right. We really didn't have anything like it before this point because we had friendships. You know, we had Cap and Bucky, we had Tony and Rhodey, but those were like adult friendships. And it's interesting too because they didn't need to do like they could have gone the Harry Osborn route, they could have gone another route, but they chose this really interesting character, sort of gave him a different spin. And now they've built it up so well to the point where just think of that moment in Endgame when, you know, Peter obviously comes back from being snapped. And then things are sort of winding down and you see Peter back in high school and him and Ned see each other for the first time. That's one of those moments that brings the feels that you didn't really think it would. And it's because that relationship was built up so well.
I agree with that. And I like what you said at the beginning there. It's because we've seen, you know, Tony and Rhodey and we've seen Captain and Bucky. And the problem with those is that they became heroes. Rhodey became War Machine and Bucky became the Winter Soldier and 90s grunge rock musician. So it's really interesting that they always go that route, and I like that at least for a bit we got to see a little bit of a superhero and his civilian friend navigating that, and their relationship has been a keystone. And now by saying that, let's talk about how we can break that all down, because basically we're in interesting territory here with the character of Ned Leeds. You know, I think ever since Ned Leeds was first announced as Peter's best friend, it kind of raised a few eyebrows, because like Ned Leeds as his best friend isn't as well known, as you said, as someone like Harry Osborn. The goblins have been done to death in a lot of Spider-Man movies, so they needed to move away from that in a really organic way and enter Ned Leeds, who was just this really genuine, heartfelt character. But the longer this character spends in the MCU, the more you got to question, is he destined for something more? Is he destined to suit up not for the side of good, but for the side of evil? And could he become the Hobgoblin? Do you like the Hobgoblin as a villain? What are your thoughts about the Hobgoblin?
I do, because I really do like the Hobgoblin, because, you know, we had the Green Goblin for a while, and some people would say it's derivative, but it actually is a sort of a nice switch up between the Green Goblin, which we have gotten once, twice, three times, so many times. And it's cool because it's taking something we know, like in the tech, in the look, and it's giving it sort of a fresh feel. So I really do like the Hobgoblin as a villain. Bringing him into the MCU might prove difficult, especially since Ned Leeds isn't the first Hobgoblin, isn't like the origin of Hobgoblin. But, you know, the MCU's changed a lot of stuff in terms of origins and things and characters we know. And we've liked when they've done that before, so I don't see why they couldn't do it again.
Sure, there's absolute faith that they'll be able to adapt this character fully, because I think the whole goblin mythology is such an important part to Spider-Man's just character overall, that it would be interesting for the MCU to sidestep the origins of Norman Osborn and Harry Osborn and go straight to the Hobgoblin, which is more of an after effect of the Goblin. And I think that actually creates a very interesting story idea, that there is this some type of goblin technology out there. And if the Hobgoblin's creation first leads to more Norman Osborn and Harry Osborn as like these big bad architects, you know, of the MCU, as Norman Osborn as this legitimate threat to not just Spider-Man, but to everyone overall who's working from the shadows. I think that's a great way to go with the character and to switch things up, especially if his first move, his first introduction is by affecting someone like Ned, someone who is so good-hearted and someone so genuine and such a good friend to Peter, and turning him to the dark side. Then that immediately creates this level of anger between Peter and the guy who did this to his best friend, just Ned, which I think is just an interesting way to go with the character overall. Let's talk about ways that Ned could become the Hobgoblin, and let's get the tough one out of the way first. And in a word, it's jealousy. It would be a very tough sell, I think, to do this, to go this route. But I think it would be a very honest, very mature way to take this relationship. For so long, these two have been together. These two have been side by side. And as they're growing into their adulthood lives, they're kind of separating a little bit. Spider-Man Far From Home played with that concept that there was this hint of jealousy between Ned and MJ because of MJ's now part of their group. And, Ned was like, I've known longer, it's like, this is my role. And they had that fun bickering, and that was fun in that movie. But what if that leads to something more? And that warps my mindset a little bit there. Do you think Ned could go down a jealous path? Do you think there's a jealous bone in Ned's body?
I do. And you brought up a really good example of it in terms of MJ coming in. But there's even been sort of Easter eggs laid before that. Remember when, in Spider-Man Homecoming, when Peter is first telling Ned about his powers because Ned catches him, and Ned even, it's played off as a joke, but Ned even sort of says, like, oh, is that spider there? Like, could it bite me? Like, I mean, even if it hurt, I would still let it bite me. And it's played off as a joke, but given the context that now Ned might become, a supervillain, an enemy of Peter Parker, you look on that moment a little differently and think, okay, maybe he really was sort of, the jealousy started really, really early, and then you're right, MJ comes into the picture, and Ned's like, well, like, I knew first, and it's played off as a joke, but putting those moments in this different context really makes them make sense. They're the kind of moments that once people see Ned as Hobgoblin, they'll go back and rewatch the MCU and see those moments and think, oh my gosh, why didn't we sort of see this coming? So yes, I think there's definitely a jealous bone in Ned's body. I haven't been convinced yet that there is such a point of jealousy that Ned would betray Peter, do something evil just to overcome that jealousy. I don't think he's that evil yet, but I think there are ways to either bring that out of him or even like put that into him. And what I'm sort of talking about first is Ned's a genius. He's sort of played off as this joke character, but like he goes to that same genius high school as Peter Parker. He helped Peter bypass Tony Stark's suit, and he was his guy in the chair. Like, Ned is a smart person. So just picture a world where Ned says, I want to help Peter. In my jealousy of not being able to sort of help Peter, like Peter can do things better than I can, I'm going to create this serum, this formula that maybe gives me enhanced abilities, which is actually very congruent to the Hobgoblin and the Green Goblin. And then maybe this serum warps his mind a little bit to where that little bit of jealousy that we've seen from Ned so far turns into dangerous jealousy and warps his mind to where he thinks wrong is right and right is wrong. And I think that's a really interesting way to sort of turn Ned against Peter.
I love that example so much. I think having Ned create the serum out of a sense of just like, okay, I'm going to initially start to help Peter is a very interesting way to start the goblin process, because there was two ways in my mind to play it, and I actually think your way was better. My way was Oscorp does create this goblin serum, and Ned gets a hold of it and decides to take it to do everything we just talked about to kind of help Peter, but then it turns him bad. I actually like your way more, because what your way does is has Ned have agency of create this and show off his genius side, and then the after effects of that is Oscorp getting a hold of Ned's twisted goblin serum and then using that to introduce more of Norman Osborn and the Osborns and Green Goblin. And I think what yours does better than my thought was just puts Ned front and center of all of it and shows just how talented he is and how dangerous that is to the character. So I like that. I like that a lot.
Well, thank you. I also like the idea of starting with Norman Osborn, and because that's sort of the origin of Ned Leeds as the Hobgoblin, if I'm remembering correctly, is he's sort of used at first and framed for being the Hobgoblin, and then eventually he becomes it. So that way is also very feasible for Norman Osborn to have created this serum. He does some crime, needs someone to blame it on, somehow bumps into Ned, who he learns is maybe Spider-Man's friend, or Spider-Man's even guy in the chair, and finds a way to sort of pin it on him, because we forget that in this universe now, people know who Spider-Man is. None of Spider-Man's friends, family, are sort of safe from the villains of the world.
I agree with that. I think that would be a great way to show the consequences of Far From Home's cliffhanger, is by actually, showing that the people around him are kind of in danger, because that is a part of Spider-Man's character that I think the MCU's kind of missed out on, is the fact that he has to keep his secret identity and live this tough life because of the people around him are like seriously endangered. And I hate to say it, but I want Spider-Man to suffer more in the MCU because that is such a vital part of his character. I always liked Spider-Man a lot as a character growing up, because he wasn't, Superman, he wasn't Batman, he wasn't all these people. He was a guy struggling to pay his bills. It's a struggle for life of not being with the woman he loved right away, having failed relationships and being estranged from his friends because he kept having to ditch them and not share with them his true self. And I think that's an element that's missing from the character, and there's a good reason for that, because that's really dark for the MCU. But I would still like that for a character, and I think a good compromise for that is by compromising Ned, and because then it shows the true consequences of this superhero life that Peter has to live. And then as he goes about becoming a full-on superhero in his adulthood, he will fully understand the weight of what a secret identity means, and the people that he's lost along the way. And Ned might be a casualty for that. I'd be heartbroken, but actually, if they go that route, that might be a little better.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and you're very right. We have sort of missed that element of tragedy from this version of Peter Parker. Because when Spider-Man was introduced to the MCU, they sort of said, okay, we can't do the same origin story we've done 3 times. Like, people have seen it before. So this sounds terrible, but we missed out on Uncle Ben's death. We didn't get to see Uncle Ben's death. We missed out on Gwen Stacy's death. These are moments that have impacted the character in movies and comics before. The closest thing we've sort of had is Iron Man dying. Right. However, I've always sort of felt that Peter Parker's Avengers life and Peter Parker's personal life have been kept very far apart. In terms of large scale, Spider-Man's really only been involved with things with the Avengers and with Iron Man, and so those parts of his life have felt different. I think a way to combine them is to do this with Ned. Think turning him against Peter, sort of giving him what this situation that Captain America had to go through for so long, only making it a little more different because Ned actually knows what he's doing, and Ned is actually on the opposite side of Peter.
Yeah. I think you bring up excellent points. It just breaks my heart to say all those things, because I want these two just to be BFFs forever and for Peter to live a happy life, but I guess that is just so opposite of what I guess Spider-Man normally is as a character. So we've kind of talked about different ways that this Ned Leeds can become the Hobgoblin and kind of become Peter's enemy and set up some very interesting conflict. But there is another option out there that could do what I think the MCU does best, is like have its cake and eat it too, of be able to maintain the status quo of both Peter and Ned being friends, but also having a Ned Leeds version of the Hobgoblin. And the only way for that is obviously the multiverse. As we've talked about before, and a lot of people have talked about before, is like the multiverse is going to be a huge part of the MCU going forward. We're going to see the seeds in Phase 4, and then it's going to be a major player in Phase 5 and probably Phase 6 and beyond. Like the multiverse is the thing. We know that Doctor Strange is going to be in Spider-Man's sequel. We know that Electro's coming back, which implies that Spider-Man is taking a trip to the multiverse. And if Peter's hopping worlds and the world that he goes to, if in the Sonyverse itself, the version of Hobgoblin is Ned Leeds, that would be interesting, because then Peter would be up against an enemy that he thinks he knows, because he thinks he knows Ned, and he would try to save him, would try to help him, would try to see the good in him. But if this version of Ned Leeds, that's in a different universe, is just completely evil to its core, how does Peter fight against something like that? Would Peter stick to his guns and do what he did with the Vulture and, try to see the good in him and save him no matter what, or realize that his friend's lost? How do you think Peter would respond to a different multiverse Ned Leeds?
Well, I think this multiverse concept is so interesting that the MCU has set up, because you can essentially give us villains, give us characters, without having to show us any of their backstory. You can give us a villain and say, hey, you missed their backstory, it happened in a different universe. For Peter Parker, this Peter Parker that we know, to show up in a different universe and come across Ned Leeds as the Hobgoblin, you have to think that in that universe, something happened where Ned and Peter were either never friends or they were friends for a while and there was a major divide in their relationship. All that still happened, but this Peter hasn't experienced it. So it's really interesting to see that Peter knows Ned as a certain way, but this Ned he will be going up against knows a different Peter a certain way. So it's also interesting to think of that from that sort of point of view, that mirror concept point of view, because the question is going to be, can Peter separate his feelings from the Ned he knows versus the Ned that's in front of him? And I love this concept for all characters. Like, I'm so excited for characters to venture into other universes and see versions of characters that they've come to know and how they're going to deal with it.
I agree with that. I think that opens up a whole avenue of different storytelling options, and first and foremost keeps it on the character level. It's not just interesting to see these different versions of characters, it's interesting to see how the characters we've come to know and love respond to these different versions of characters. And that's where you're going to get your really dramatic heft, like that's going to get the really good storytelling options to see this different variety of characters that we're familiar with that are slightly different, and see how our characters, our OGs, respond. Now I'm so torn between which version of Ned Leeds as the Hobgoblin that I want to see. Because overall, what this conversation is totally enforcing me, I want to see Ned Leeds as the Hobgoblin. I want to see him in a glider, in a scary, yellowish, Halloweenish mask, flying around and causing trouble for Peter. I'm just not sure which version I want to see, because I think all options really create fascinating story avenues for the future. Which, out of all of them, which one would you prefer?
Well, I will say that that multiverse option we sort of talked about, there's already precedence in the MCU for it. Look at Gamora. Gamora is a different universe version of herself living in this current universe. I'm really excited to see where that story goes, but she doesn't even know Peter anymore. Like, that's the relationship I'm talking about. You saw it briefly during the final battle in Endgame, but Peter's like, I thought I lost you, and Gamora's like, I don't even know you.
Yeah.
So that's the interesting kind of dynamic and relationships I'm excited to see. So I think the multiverse option is the one that is best set up right now, especially if they're going to be doing elements of Spider-Verse. I've heard talk that other Spider-Men are going to be in it. But if you're asking me right now, I really like the idea of taking Jacob Batalon's Ned Leeds, as we know him, and playing up the fact that he has spent all this time by Peter's side. Maybe Peter neglects him a little bit, or maybe Peter, spends more time with MJ, and it leads Ned to a path where he wants to better himself. He doesn't feel useful to Peter anymore because maybe MJ's his guy in the chair now, or gal in the chair, whatever the technical term is. And now Ned feels like he needs to better himself, and so he shows us how smart of a character he is, and he creates the Goblin formula. He creates his, and from that he creates his own weapons, or maybe he finds some leftover Stark weapons that he turns into his own weapons. I know the multiverse is being set up, but I'm just really interested to see, because if we see a multiverse Ned Leeds, we don't really know what happened to the old Ned Leeds. Like, he probably gets pushed to the side, but that character's been set up in a way I like, and I want to see him go further.
Yeah, I agree with that, because Ned Leeds in the multiverse as a Hobgoblin is like a fun Easter egg, basically, right? It's like a fun, oh, look, it's fun, it's a nod to his comic origins. While if our Ned Leeds turns into the Hobgoblin and gets set on this path of any of the ways in which we discussed, it's a sadder option for sure, and it's a tougher option. But I think it's the better option, because then that creates long-term consequences for Spider-Man the character, and just overall will shine a really interesting new dynamic to Peter and Ned's relationship. So even though the multiverse is cool, and I think maybe if there's a way for it to do both, maybe there's a version of the multiverse where we see an early version of Ned Leeds as Hobgoblin in the multiverse, right? Like, he's like the evil version, and then it kind of shows how closely these universes are intertwined with each other, that Ned Leeds is kind of set on a path like to become the Hobgoblin in a similar way. Then maybe that's an interesting idea to play with if we have a lot of time with the character. But overall, yeah, I think our Ned Leeds should become the Hobgoblin.
I do, and I like that pitch a lot. Like, you could have Spider-Man see briefly what Ned could become, and then go back to his own universe and take steps to avoid it. And what's the famous saying? What's the famous saying from I think it's Master Oogway in Kung Fu Panda? It's, one often meets their destiny on the road they take to avoid it. So Peter could be taking these steps to be like, hey, Ned, don't turn evil, and actually pushes Ned in his own universe to become the Hobgoblin.
Thank you for quoting Kung Fu Panda, and yeah, and also it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It's like this, and then that shows the very tragic nature of everything that we're trying to do. I think I'm convinced. Do you have any other final thoughts about the Hobgoblin?
No, I'm excited. Like I said, there's so many other aspects to the Hobgoblin. Ned Leeds isn't the only Hobgoblin. I think it'd be interesting to maybe introduce another character who was the first one, and then maybe we get a cliffhanger at the end of Spider-Man 3 of Ned sort of finding the serum and things like that. I think there's so many different ways it can go. But I'm just really excited because Jacob Batalon, I think, is a really good actor. And I think he's played Ned in such a way that sort of made us fall in love with him. And I think the best test for him now would be to make us fall out of love with him and hate ourselves for it. This all sounds like very depressing stuff, but I couldn't be more excited for it.
Exactly. It's what are we doing to ourselves? It's like we want to be sad at these movies. No, I agree with you. Jacob Batalon is very talented, and I'm excited to see where his character goes. But I'm going to turn it over to you guys, the audience. We've discussed a lot of different ways that Ned can become the Hobgoblin. Which one is your favorite? Do you want to see our Ned become Hobgoblin, or do you just want to stick to a normal, different version multiverse of the Hobgoblin, or something else? Please let us know down in the comments below, and thank you all so much for listening to another exciting episode of CBR Saga. I would like to thank Nick very much for joining me, and we will see you all next time. Thank you very much.
Spider-Man's name is Peter Parker. What the...
You're the kind of man this city needs. Because, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we all know this city needs help. We need heroes.
Tell Spider-Man.
I need you to come with me. We need your help. Look, it's not overselling it to say that the fate of the universe is at stake.
Manipulations can create branches in time. You weren't manipulating the space-time continuum, you were breaking it.
This was a mistake.
I'm Peter, by the way. Thanks for stepping up for me.
Who am I? I'm Spider-Man.